Action.
Okay. All right, folks, thank you for attending today. My name is Brent Lagergren. I'm in-house counsel for Rural Community Hospitals of America, which is now the operator of this facility, as well as our 11 other institutions, if you will, scattered across the country. And I am also the compliance officer. So it's my job that annually I try to get out to the various facilities with regard to a presentation that focuses on the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, as well as other applicable laws, the compliance program, and some comments with regards to the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act. Usually this occurs in somewhat routine fashion. However, there's a little bit more urgency that's added this year, simply because we just completed an EMTALA investigation at one of our other facilities in Kansas. Typically, these investigations occur as a result of a patient complaint, somebody who's not satisfied with the treatment that they received within the emergency room, or a facility who's received a transfer that they didn't think was appropriate. However, in this particular instance, what happened was this was a scheduled licensure survey out at one of the Kansas facilities, and they pulled a certain number of charts from the emergency room, and lo and behold, the very first one that they pulled was had a physician note in it that said, I'm not going to treat this guy anymore until he pays me, which is it just raises all sorts of red flags, if you will. So what started out as a routine licensure survey mutated into an EMTALA investigation, and it's one that we just completed literally within the last month or so. So once this timeline starts and they validate that there's a complaint, and obviously they discovered it on site, the surveyors did, they then send you a letter indicating that you have 90 days to submit a corrective action plan and have it approved, and then undergo a secondary survey, if you will, and provided that that happens, you're fine. On the other hand, if you fail to do this within the prescribed timeline, then you may have your Medicare provider agreement forfeited, if you will. And obviously you can imagine that if that were to happen, we'd essentially be out of business, since a large amount of our revenues are derived from Medicare, if you will. So again, I'm here to talk about EMTALA and the other components that I mentioned. And so if you just sort of follow along in your handout, I think we'll be able to get through this in a fairly expeditious manner. And if you'd share your information with Ben, I would appreciate it.
Got it.
Okay.
He's listening intently.
Very good. EMTALA is not a malpractice law. This is essentially a civil rights law, if you will. This all started back in the 80s. It was signed into law initially by President Ronald Reagan, and it's been modified several times since then, of course. But it was adopted to respond to a growing problem, principally on the East Coast and the West Coast, involving what they call patient dumping, if you will. So it would not be an unusual practice for a patient that looked less than, shall we say, flush, to come to the emergency room, and if they were unable to provide evidence of the wherewithal necessary to pay for the service, and by that I mean either the cash or an insurance card, they were invited to go down the road. They didn't even want to fiddle with them. So sometimes this actually took place outside the emergency room, if you will, and they weren't even able to exit the car. They were just flagged or thumbed down the road, if you will. So this was growing more pronounced, and the public outcry was also becoming louder and louder, so this resulted in the passage of this act known as the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, and for short, EMTALA, if you will. Essentially what it applies to, and the meaning of were clarified back in 2003, if you hold yourself out as having an emergency department, which virtually all of our facilities do, so there's no question about the law's applicability, we in fact do that. Our ERs are open 24/7. So essentially, we don't have to worry about whether or not it applies. It certainly does. Again, I have briefly discussed exactly the reasoning behind which this actually transpired. Other forms of violations that this law addresses is that transferring patients from one hospital to another before either they are stabilized or there's any communication prior to the transfer taking place, and certain elements of information are provided. There's also what you call delaying care with regards to patients. In other words, people coming into the emergency room and they're invited to have a seat, and that's the last time that anybody addresses their concerns. So again, in April of 1986, President Reagan signed into law under COBRA the EMTALA Act. This is a policy and procedure driven law. The essential requirements are that hospitals must have policies in place which reflect that medical screening examinations are to be provided to all patients who come to the hospital seeking care to determine if they have an emergency medical need. So this is sort of an equity-based law. If two people come in with essentially substantially similar symptoms, they are to be treated in similar fashion without consideration for their financial status, if you will. These policies also assure that excess is going to be provided to all of the resources of the hospital. In other words, the hospital cannot selectively withhold resources based upon what they perceive to be the financial abilities of a patient. And essentially the resources or access to them is to be provided to determine if a patient has an emergency medical condition. We also are required to have a list of on-call physicians, which we do, although a great deal of our care is provided through mid-level providers and to a certain extent RNs. And regardless of where a patient presents in the hospital or incurs an emergency while on hospital property, hospital will provide needed medical screening examinations and proper stabilizing care. Initially, essentially the requirements were confined to the emergency room, the four corners of the emergency room. This has been expanded with the passage of time and the revisions to the Act to now include the entirety of the hospital campus, sometimes known as the 250-yard rule. It basically means if they show up on your property and you're aware of their presence, then tag, you're it, essentially. And so it becomes more than just the responsibility of the folks in the emergency room. It becomes the responsibility of all of us, provided that somebody sees somebody. It could be plant ops, it could be anybody looking out the window, see a patient in distress in the parking lot. Anyway, that becomes our responsibility. So this is the other provisions that we have to deal with. Patients may not be transferred if they remain at risk of deterioration due to or during transfer to another facility unless the needs of the patient cannot be met at the current hospital. Well, essentially that refers to virtually all of the circumstances that would trigger a transfer. We're not going to be transferring to another critical access hospital. The presumption is that our transfers are going to go upward always, if you will, to a higher level of service. The only possible exceptions to that would be if the patient and or the patient's legal guardian or legal representative would dictate otherwise, and that would be very rarely, if at all. Patients may not be transferred if they remain at risk of deterioration due to or during a transfer unless a physician or properly designated person has certified in writing that the risks are justified by the benefits to obtain. Essentially, and we have policies that delineate all of this stuff. Julie has a binder. It's all going to be electronically available, if you will. But essentially, all of these requirements as set forth here are enumerated and set forth in our transfer form. Have any of you seen that with regards to outgoing patients? I know that you're all from different areas, so it would not directly affect you. But anyway, there's a transfer form that accompanies all of the transfers that has all of this information. That transfer form has been through about 6 of these investigations, and so it's well traveled, if you will, in terms of having been originally vetted and then vetted again, if you will. So The patients who may not be transferred without acceptance by a receiving hospital, but that's almost a formality, provided that the hospital has the required capabilities and for the level of care that you're seeking, and they have the space as well in order to accommodate it. So they cannot legally decline a transfer, if you will, unless they don't meet one of these criteria, if you will. And essentially, the only reason that would ever occur is if they're on diversion. Simply, they don't have the space, if you will. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to get gained periodically by a receiving hospital who simply doesn't want to deal with it. Typically, this sort of thing happens in the wee hours of the morning when you have a resident on duty at one of these hospitals where you're attempting to transfer a patient, and they have no idea what they're doing with regards to the law. They probably have never even heard of it. But I can tell you that if that becomes a problem, then the first order of business is to inform Julie, and in turn will probably inform me. But we've had these circumstances, not here, but at other facilities, principally in Oklahoma, where a resident, such as I described, declined to take a transfer, and we threatened them with a reporting of an EMTALA complaint, if you will. And the first thing the next day, the CEO of that hospital, in addition to that person who was responsible for provider relations, made a trek to our hospital in order to offer apologies, number one, and then secondly, tell them what corrective actions would be in place so that that would never happen again. These are, and that kind of segues into the next in terms of penalties of violation, for violations of EMTALA. This is a serious law, if you will, in hospitals with fewer of 100 beds, which it virtually refers to all of our facilities, could be forced to pay $25,000 per violation. This would be as a result of a particularly egregious violation. Same for physicians, if you will. They could be assessed personally up to $50,000. Now again, we've been able, and I've been able, over the course of my career to avert any imposition of monetary penalties. It doesn't mean that they're not out there and they can use it. So, but again, if you're in a large institution where you may have several hundred employees, this could be an extremely burdensome process in order to conduct educational sessions, such as the one we're doing for this 800 employee base. I've had to do that, and basically it's around-the-clock exercise, if you will. So, in terms of this facility as well as our others, it becomes a little bit more manageable. But nonetheless, we don't want to test the limits of that, if you will. Ultimately, as I indicated, the 90-day, I think we're already signed.
Yeah, I just noticed I was the last one who had signed that one, and
Yeah.
didn't realize there was another one.
Yeah. And anybody who hasn't signed that, be sure to do so, if you will. So anyway, it's a very serious law. As I indicated earlier, if there's not, if we don't meet the conditions in terms of corrective actions, which include education, among other things, and in the case of the Kansas survey that I mentioned, it involved terminating a contract with that physician for the provision of ED call coverage services. So he got hit pretty substantially in the pocketbook, if you will. So we just simply couldn't afford the luxury of retaining a provider in that capacity who had no understanding or appreciation of what it was we were required to do under EMTALA, if you will.
Was there a fine, because CMS can fine a physician independent of the hospital, right?
They can.
Did they
and
fine that
No,
physician?
they don't. And that gets back, they have a standard, what is called a high level of egregiousness. And although I thought it was abhorrent, apparently it wasn't egregious enough for CMS to make a referral to the OIG, who then, on a subsequent investigation, might have imposed the monetary penalties. But he got hit in his own way, simply by virtue of the termination of the coverage agreement, if you will. So anyway, it's something that we don't want to explore the limits of. We want to avoid that, and so hence my presentation, if you will. There are three distinct clinical components to EMTALA, which we'll talk about. The first being that there has to be an appropriate medical screening examination given to anybody who presents to the emergency room, if you will. And that doesn't mean that it's the same examination. It's gonna last the same amount of time. It's gonna be the same in terms of complexity. That's gonna fit the acuity of the patient presenting, if you will. But at the end of the day, there has to be evidence that we're complying with our own policy with regards to medical screening examinations. And what that is a screening to determine the existence of an emergency medical condition which is the same or similar to the screening provided to all patients. We get back to that equity feature, if you will. So two people presenting, and we don't know what their financial background is or status, but if they're presenting with the same set of symptoms, or approximately the same, we have to be able to demonstrate that we've treated them more or less equally in terms of our treatment, if you will. Anyway, the following in yellow, which I believe is articulated on your form, are the elements which are commonly accepted as the component parts to an emergency medical, or the emergency medical screening examination, if you will. These are not articulate, you won't find them in the law itself. Basically, we've been able to glean these from the reams of litigation that have taken place since 1986 in terms of interpreting the law and the responsibilities of providers. So first, there's a log entry with disposition, and this is to be done contemporaneous with the patient's arrival, not 2 weeks after the fact, which we've had occur at other facilities when they go back and try to reconstruct what happened, and you can't do that. So secondly, there's a triage record, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but essentially that's a determination as to the order, if you will. Now, most times that won't be a factor because you'll be dealing in a linear fashion with one patient at a time. But, you know, I-70 being out here, it's not beyond the pale that you're gonna have an automobile collision where there'd be multiple casualties, and obviously the ones that require treatment first are the ones that you're gonna see treatment or provide treatment for, and the person coming in with upper respiratory something or other may be relegated to a secondary position. That's just how that works. But you have to have some indication in your record that that's indeed what happened, and your justification for not seeing that patient the moment that they hit the door, if you will. There has to be the ongoing recording of vital signs, and I know you have an anecdotal comment with regards to that.
I don't know that there's really anybody in here that it applies to changing your practice, but so when Swift and I did the audit, there were a couple of charts that fell out for vital signs. One of them didn't have vital signs at discharge, which is a requirement with EMTALA, not just something we should be doing. But there was one patient who was here for a duration of 2 hours, had vital signs on admission and on discharge, but nothing in between. And I felt like with the patient's condition, a surveyor would probably say, don't you think you might have assessed vital signs? So.
Hence the word ongoing. So there has to be some sort of periodic assessment so that you don't lose track of that patient, and the acuity level remains more or less the same. So, and thus the urgency. There has to be an oral history that the patient gives, if they're able, of course. There's a physical exam. There's the use of all the available and necessary testing resources that would come into play for a medical screening examination. If you had to call a physician in, you have to do that. Again, you can't just withhold that if it's required. And then there's the discharge or transfer vital signs, as Julie just alluded to. And as importantly as those previous 8 elements, there's documentation of such. Because it's the old adage, if you didn't document it, it did not happen. So there has to be evidence from wherever these various component parts are, including the central log, the medical record, or some other, the nursing note, the physician's note, that it can be determined by a surveyor that you have done what you need to do in terms of an appropriate medical screening examination.
I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
It's kind of based on that. Does this fully demonstrate to them that you're treating, if you can accurately show all of these,
Yes.
this demonstrates to them that you're treating all patients the same, or does that have to be measured
No,
a
no,
different way?
this will do it.
This will do it, okay.
Yeah, as long as they have evidence that there's, again, this gets back to the point, you know, you're not gonna spend the same amount of time
Right,
and dedicate the same number of resources for treatment. You know, that's gonna be determined by the severity of what the patient presents with. By the same token, if you can demonstrate that all this exists, then they're gonna be fine.
okay.
And also, in terms of referring back to Julie's policy book, that articulates what it is you're supposed to do, and so you're gonna be in good shape. It's when you come in and they can't find any of this stuff that really it's a problem, because the propensity of the court is to come down on the side of a plaintiff with regards to complaint, as opposed to the institution. And it doesn't matter if you did it or not, if you can't document it or you can't find it, it becomes irrelevant. So the patient prevails in that regard. So, does an appropriate medical screening examination have to correctly diagnose the problem? Well, this is one of the ironies associated with this. You can cross the T's, dot the I's, and do everything exactly appropriate with this and arrive at absolutely the wrong clinical conclusion. So the answer to that is no. This provides you no immunity from or insulation from a med mal claim. This basically only does one thing, and that assures that you're going to be in compliance with EMTALA. Can a hospital's policies and procedures be used to test the appropriateness of a medical screening exam? Well, having just reviewed all of our policies as a result of this Hillsborough or Kansas facility occurrence, that basically triggered a review on my part and the governance part for all these institutions. So all of our EMTALA policies have now been upgraded, reviewed, signed by the appropriate people, and made available. However, and so they're pristine from that standpoint. So, however, they can become your worst enemy if you decide to ignore them, because there you have it, what you're supposed to do, and then you've decided that for whatever reason that you're not going to follow them. So that gets us into even more trouble, if you will, potentially. Can a hospital's policies and procedures be used to test the appropriateness of a medical screening exam? Well, that's the question we just answered. Of course it can. And then this gets to, we touched on it a little bit earlier, what does come to the ED mean? The patient obviously presents to the within the four corners of the emergency department. That's fairly obvious. But now, through the amendment to the law over the passage of time, it now extends to, and is commonly referred to, the 250-yard rule, if you will. So if the patient shows up on your premises, whether it's in the clinic, crashes in the clinic, in the parking lot, out there wandering around, and you're aware of it, it's your obligation, if you will. So, and also, if a patient is in a hospital-owned ambulance for a purpose of examination or treatment, and basically we only have one facility that owns its own ambulance service and where this would actually technically apply. But if a patient arrives in an ambulance that's not owned by you, but as soon as they hit your property, it's your tag, you're in. There's only one exception to this, and that is where there's an exchange of a patient between a ground ambulance and a life flight that basically is independent of what of the emergency room. The only exception to that would be is if they requested assistance of some sort, and then of course your obligations would kick in. Otherwise, you just stand back, you cordon off the appropriate area to let them do their thing, and life goes on, so to speak. Any questions thus far? When does the EMTALA responsibility end? Well, there's a couple of instances. Number one, if it's determined that the emergency medical condition does not exist, if it's been stabilized, or if the patient is admitted to an inpatient service, your obligations under EMTALA cease to exist at that point. However, there's a corresponding issue that happens here. The obligation from a receiving facility standpoint with respect to a transfer also goes away. Now, we've had a situation, it hadn't happened for a while, in one of our Oklahoma facilities, where they had a patient came into the ER. It was determined that they needed to be hospitalized. They went through the medical screening exam process, and then they were subsequently admitted to the facility. About 36 hours later, the patient crashed and needed to be transferred. Well, at that time, all bets are off in terms of the corresponding obligation by the receiving facility. So we were basically reduced to being a beggar, if you will, in terms of getting a facility to accept this patient. And they can ask any question they want at that point. You know, is the patient insured? Do you want to guarantee the financial, the payment of the patient if they're indigent? They can impose any obligation that they want. Now, in most cases, if that were to happen, you historically have certain transfer relationships in place, and they'll probably give you a pass, if you will. But it's not something that you can go to the bank on, literally, because their only obligation is to accept a patient is under the umbrella of the EMTALA. And if you will, what happens, and what we, if the patient, if there's uncertainty as to whether or not the emergency medical condition has been resolved or might reoccur, then they can utilize the observation category, if you will, for that limited period of time, during which the EMTALA obligations for both us as well as any potential receiving facility continue to be in place. So,
Do our transfer agreements, like with CenterPoint and St. Luke's, do they require them to take the patient if they have a bed? Or is it
Yes.
really just a piece of paper that
well,
meets
it's
the
both.
state reg?
It's both. It
Okay, but
will.
it does-
Yeah, most of them have been adjusted to reflect this language in terms of an EMTALA component, that if they have the ability to do so, they will do so in accordance with that particular law. So, not all, but most.
The state requires us to have transfer agreements, so we have
Right.
them with CenterPoint Research and St. Luke's.
They're not, again, given the fact that these larger institutions just start trembling at the very notion of an EMTALA investigation, they're not gonna give you flack unless, like I said, there's an outlier, a resident who is a bonehead, essentially, doesn't know anything about the law and has decided to freestyle it, if you will. And those can be quickly addressed, to be quite honest. So those, fortunately, those occurrences, while at one point might have been more routine, are less so in these days and times. Who can perform the medical screening exam? Well, initially, and I'm glad you brought that up, Ben. Originally, it was the physicians that could only perform these investigations or examination. However, with the passage of time, there's an acknowledgement that smaller hospitals in remote areas, rural areas, simply don't have the wherewithal to retain, even if they can find them, they can't retain physicians to provide 24/7 coverage of the emergency room. So they've created this supplemental category, if you will, called qualified medical personnel, which in most instances, provided that you meet the requirements that the competencies for what is called QMPs are approved by the medical staff, and then there's also a vetting at the governing board level in terms of a signed policy or board resolution, and we have both, they can do that. Now, there are limitations. For instance, in Oklahoma, RNs are strictly prohibited from doing that. As Julie informed me today, PAs, physician assistants here in Missouri, because of their having to be proximate to their supervising physician, that's not practical, if you will. But everywhere else, under the EMTALA regs, APRNs, advanced practice registered nurses, PAs, and RNs are considered qualified medical personnel. Now, the state can either accept that or overrule it, but essentially we have the mechanism in place where we can accommodate all of that for virtually all of our institutions. So here it's physicians and APRNs principally, with an occasional RN that has to step in and fill the void, so to speak. Any questions? What is the difference between triage and medical screening exam? And this question came up this morning, as a matter of fact. If you recall back to the highlighted area, the triage is but one element of those other 9 that I described. It's a system of ordering. It dates back to the Napoleonic Wars. Been in the wake of the battle in terms of trying to assess casualties. They made a determination that X amount, you couldn't, it was ridiculous to extend or expend any resources. They couldn't be salvaged. There was those that needed a pill or green soap and a bandage that could be forced back into battle. And there were those that were going to take a much more extended amount of rehabilitation, recuperation. So essentially, it's just an ordering system. Now, it's not even going to be particularly relevant in most instances because, as I said, this is a linear process. Only one person will come in at a time, typically. And you don't have this, you don't even have to contend with that. But periodically, there will be the mass casualty, and then you're going to have to make a decision. It's going to be needed, you have to document it with regards to the order you saw people in. And this will also be reflected to some degree in the ER log as well. So, what if the patient refuses the medical screening exam or further treatment? Well, they always can do that. You know, sometimes you'll be lucky enough to, and they'll still remain, and they'll sign the designated forms. The policies that we've developed all have refusal to be transferred option. There's a refusal to be seen, a refusal to be treated, those sorts of things. Now, in terms of a patient who comes into the hospital that lacks capacity, in other words, referring back to an automobile rack, if you will, then consent for treatment transfer is assumed with regard to that. So we're relatively unrestricted. In the other case, you'll run into situations where a patient was there 1 minute and maybe you all were busy, and then you go back to the waiting room and they're not there. So you're still going to have the responsibility for documenting the approximate time they left, the arrival, what you knew about them. You got to get as much information as you can at the point of presentation, and that'll be in the emergency room log. And then you have to fill out the appropriate form. Again, if they want to leave, though, if they're already there and they just decided, you know, phooey, you have an AMA form against medical advice that has to be executed, or should be. Now, if they refuse to sign anything, you're still going to have to document it to the best of your ability, and also give the reason if you know that they wouldn't execute it. So, again, documentation is going to be your friend throughout this process, if you will. Any questions? Stabilizing treatment. What is EMTALA stabilizing treatment requirement? A hospital must either provide further medical examination and such treatment as may be required to stabilize the medical condition within the staff and facilities available at the hospital. When the hospital has determined that the individual has an emergency medical condition, or transfer the individual in accordance with the requirements of EMTALA. A hospital can be held in violation of EMTALA for either failing to detect the nature of an emergency medical condition through inadequate screening procedures, or the nature of the individual's emergency medical condition is detected, failing to stabilize the condition before releasing or transferring the individual in violation of EMTALA criteria. So although this looks very close to being a med mal issue, it's still a procedural one in terms of the EMTALA regs. What constitutes an emergency medical condition? Essentially, the next 2 paragraphs are a fairly tortured explanation of what that is, no doubt written by a federal bureaucrat who may or may not have ever seen an emergency medical condition. For those of you who work with this stuff every day, it kind of goes back to the fact you know it when you see it. So I won't bore you with reading that. So anyway, the definition or the transfer requirement is the next one. Does everybody know what CMS is? Have they ever heard of that?
Can you say it, Brian?
Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Absolutely. Excellent. So this
Or
is
content management system.
He's the IT guy.
Yeah, I think that second one is an inside deal. So, but it's the successor organization to what they used to call HCFA, which was the Healthcare Financing Administration. Nonetheless, both agencies, CMS now has the responsibility of not only determining the rate at which will be reimbursed for providing services to Medicare beneficiaries, it also has responsibility for enforcing EMTALA, if you will. Now, the feds don't have a police force at the institutional level, but they contract with the state in order to do that. So it would not be highly unusual for you to see a person in the context of an EMTALA violation that had been out to see you previously in the context of a routine licensure survey. So anyway, CMS has determined that hospitals must provide an appropriate transfer of an unstabilized individual to another medical facility if the individual, or his or her representative, after being informed of the risks and the hospital's obligation, requests a transfer. So they, you know, the patient still gets to drive this to a certain extent. Or a physician has signed the certification that the benefits of the transfer to the patient outweigh the risk. Essentially, that will apply to the QMP as well. But there's again, referring back to the transfer form, there's a space on there for the physician certification in terms of the benefits. Sometimes they remember to sign it, sometimes they have to go back and sign it, if you will. So what is an appropriate transfer? A transfer to another facility will be appropriate when the transferring hospital provides the medical treatment within its capacity. So essentially that means we're not holding back anything. We've expended all of the resources that we have available in terms of stabilizing the medical condition, and that minimizes the risks to the individual's health. And in the case of the woman in labor, and here I digress, if you will, remembering that we collectively do not do obstetrical care. So a woman in labor presenting to the hospital, and we've had this happen, not very often, not recently, whereby it was obvious through her condition that she was pregnant, and she was informed that she would have to go somewhere else. Well, that's wrong. It's emergency medical treatment and active labor act. So anybody that comes in, regardless of what their condition is, our job, first and foremost, is to make sure that we address the emergency medical condition. Now, if this obviously gets above the primary level, if you will, that's going to quickly exhaust our ability to care for it, if you will. So somebody better be working the phones feverishly in order to effect an appropriate transfer to a facility, an acute care facility, a tertiary care facility that would be more adequate to the needs of the patient, if you will. But we don't get to tell anybody to hit the road, at least upon initial.
Yeah, when Brent says we've had that happen before, we collectively as a system have had that happen before. That did not happen here.
I didn't mean to suggest
Just
that
to-
happened here.
We
Oh.
did,
Just to clarify.
remember we did have that patient last year during that,
The snowstorm,
Blizzard.
we talked about that this morning.
That was a fairly unique set of circumstances.
yeah.
And we'll, I'll get to that, because it brought up several items in terms of the appropriateness of the transfer. Also, the receiving facility, in terms of, has to have the available space and qualified personnel, as we've already discussed, for the treatment of the individual, and has agreed, although that in many, that can be regarded as a formality. If they have the other two, they can't not agree, if you will. Has agreed to accept the transfer of the individual and to provide appropriate medical treatment. And then, of course, you send all of the information that you have at the time of the transfer with the patient, and on the assumption and the receiving facility's expectation that any outstanding tests or results will quickly go to that receiving facility as soon as they're available. And then the last is the transfer is effected through qualified medical personnel and transportation equipment. Now, the courts hate what they call privately owned vehicles, POVs, but and there are circumstances though that would necessitate the use of a POV. Number one, and it's an AMA issue, is that the patient didn't want to wait around for a transfer. They took it upon themselves to exit or take their son or daughter or whatever, because they knew they could get from point A to point B more quickly. And that becomes in their hands. Nonetheless, that has to be documented. The other situation is, and again, this is not indicative of this facility, which I think you have access to a professional emergency medical transport service, if you will. In some of our other facilities, they're not so lucky. The emergency medical transport system is a voluntary one. So as you can possibly see, the performance is going to be much more erratic in that regard. So you may be faced with the decision that has to be made. Do I wait around and risk the patient degrading here at the facility, possibly expiring, or do I throw the dice and agree to let them transport themselves in a privately owned vehicle? Hopefully that will not occur routinely, and hopefully it won't occur at all. But it is possible that the circumstances would necessitate that sort of decision, if you will. But again, that all has to be thoroughly documented if, for whatever reason, that patient is shipped via alternative means, if you will. If the patient has not been stabilized, then the following 6 conditions must be met before transferring, which in large part are similar to the others. There has to be the physician certification that the expected benefits outweigh the risks, patient consent if possible. You have to have a documented progression of efforts that were made to stabilize to the greatest extent possible. You have to have that agreement by the receiving facility, and by that I mean docs are talking to docs if applicable, QMPs are talking to QMPs, nursing's talking to nursing. There should be no question as to whether or not who knew or didn't know with regards to a transfer. The delivery of all medical records, qualified mode and personnel, and again, answering that question, may a receiving hospital with the capabilities, resources, and space refuse to accept a transfer? And the answer to that is an emphatic no. But in the event that you are in the middle of some sort of game, it needs to be disclosed to Julie and myself, and we'll be happy to intervene. Again, reflecting back to my initial statement, this is a policy-driven law, if you will. We have to have compliance policies. This morning, Julie was presented the manual with the EMTALA policies on it. Those are fresh off the press and largely developed by virtue of the experience we went through in Kansas. So all of our facilities have all been upgraded with regards to this. And any time a surveyor walked in, you should be in fine shape with regard to that. So we have to adopt a compliance policy to assure compliance with EMTALA, which would include the medical screening and exam requirements, the stabilizing obligations, and a process for dealing with transfers, which we have in abundance. We have to adopt a policy setting forth which personnel are authorized to conduct MSCs, which we have done. We have to maintain a list of on-call physicians, which we do. We have to post signage with regards to our EMTALA obligations, which is prominently displayed in the ER. It says you have, informs patients that they have the right to receive within the capability of the hospital staff and facilities an appropriate medical screening and examination. And I think I'll digress here just momentarily. There's quite there's a nexus here in terms of our obligations, in terms of under EMTALA, and coming up against our necessity to bill patients at the point of service. And sometimes those lines get a little murky, but during the process where we're trying to figure out whether or not there's an emergency medical condition, during the medical screening process, the people have to, in terms of registration, have to stand down until that's been stabilized, the condition's been stabilized, or they've been discharged, if you will. So the registration, the revenue cycle people are going to have to work closely with the clinicians in order to determine when that point is it's appropriate. Because up to that point, they can just ask, do you have an insurance card? And if they don't, you move on. So they cannot do that. They can't go beyond that point. And I know that's tricky sometimes in terms of establishing, because if we do it too soon during the medical screening examination, that's an obvious violation of EMTALA. We don't want to go there. Right, Ben? Okay.
Sorry.
So
I have a question about
Yes,
this,
sir.
because you was talking about this is somewhat of a patient-driven process. What if you've got a patient who is being very verbal that they're not being properly triaged or screened or anything, and then you got an ambulance, you know, or somebody transferring them life flight, and they're verbally saying, you guys are just trying to ship me out of your facility. How does that?
Well, number one, you document it, and then
Right.
you also document the countervailing argument,
Okay.
if you will. But recognizing, if the patient, you know, there are limits to civility here. So if the patient is, number one, is beyond that, then you need to exercise some judgment. But the patient's gonna say whatever they wanna say, and they may be lucid or they may not be lucid in terms of their saying that. But if all of the circumstances suggest otherwise to what the patient is saying, and it's documented properly,
Okay.
then that's your defense. So, and in those situations, you should not have any trouble documenting that several people overheard the thing, but that was not the condition in actuality, if you will. So, anyway, and the last one is maintaining the central log, which again is a contemporaneous function. You need to address it at the time the patient presents, and I understand that sometimes time is of the essence, but nonetheless, that's all part of the medical screening exam and your documentation base in terms of defending any EMTALA violation claims. Does anybody have any questions with regards to what I just said about EMTALA?
Do we often have problems with that? You know, somebody claiming an EMTALA violation besides the fact a doctor saying I'm not going to treat somebody.
Yeah,
till
the
they
obvious,
pay me."
aside from that, certainly not often, but they do periodically come up.
Okay.
And people just don't want to wait, you know, essentially, so they think they're being discriminated against, when in actuality, the evidence suggests otherwise.
Yeah.
That, you know, the days when we, you know, set people in a corner, and they're the only ones in there, and nobody's treating them, those are pretty much over. So you're gonna run into issues where, again, you're treating multiple patients, and somebody's left, you know, somebody's at the back of the line. That's just a metaphysical fact, if you will.
I have a quick question, hopefully. What about, is there any issue at all about diverting patients from, like, our ER to a clinic situation, as opposed to treating them in the emergency room?
No.
There's no problem with sending them?
No, there is a problem.
There is a problem?
You can't do it before your medical screening examination is
So
complete.
they have to be screened?
Yes.
As long as they're screened?
If they're there presenting to
And
do
it's-
that. Now, on the other hand, if they're there by mistake, in other words, they had an appointment at the clinic, they show up at the wrong door, then common sense, and they say, I'm here to see Dr. X, well, then you can exercise some amount of common sense, and you don't, you know, in terms of, well, they're in the clinic over here. But you can't routinely leap over that in order to get them, and it doesn't matter what you think. There's got to be some record that, you know, if they're there for treatment in the ER, you can't divert them to the clinic. Not before you've completed the medical screening exam. Again, go ahead.
It's kind of one of the reasons why we went away from allowing an RN to do that medical screening exam, because they would do that portion, talk to the doctor, and the doctor would say, well, can't they just be seen in the clinic?
Yeah.
So to take that piece out of there, our providers have to see the
Have to
patient,
see
they
it.
have to do the screening.
Okay.
And then at that point, if they determine this really isn't an ER visit, you could be seen in the clinic.
Then
Yep.
it's workable.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
But going back to those elements, there's gotta be some recognition of that encounter. And that can be very brief, but it has to be demonstrated that we satisfied our basic responsibilities. And you'll get yourself into trouble if you skip over that and, you know, immediately divert them to the clinic when you don't really know why they're there, so. We'll just go through this, the other two elements of my presentation, and I appreciate your time, we'll go through it very quickly. Our corporate compliance program, I work very closely with the facility CEOs like Julie. All of our institutions have a corporate compliance committee which meets regularly and no less frequently than quarterly. I try to attend all of them telephonically, if you will. They have a number of audit functions they perform, a lot of them having to do with EMTALA, making sure transfer forms have been filled out properly, medical screening examinations have been conducted properly, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a fairly robust program. Also involved in that is the educational component. So not only do I come out here once annually, if you will, there's an ongoing educational component that takes place in the context of orientation. Also, by virtue of the fact that this presentation is being recorded today, those that were unable to attend are going to have to endure this electronically. So,
Gonna be a YouTube sensation.
oh,
Yes.
yeah, boy.
As well as Julie.
Yeah.
Anyway, if we could get page 11 of the materials, we'll kind of skip to the crux of this, if you will. Essentially, in terms of basic compliance responsibilities, we are looking to our employees to suffer or endure training such as this. We're relying on you if you have suspect wrongdoing. We want you to make an inquiry with regards to appropriateness. That's how we keep everybody involved in the process, if you will. We want reports, but we want them good faith. We don't want reports just for the sake of reporting. And if you're trying to satisfy a grudge against a fellow employee, that's not what this is all about, if you will. And then lastly, we expect your cooperation. Now, with regard to the standards of conduct, number one, job one, is quality of care and patient safety. And we ask all of our employees to be committed to providing the highest quality care, certainly doing so with regard to patient safety and respect for patient rights. Standard number two, and this is of course in part related to that, compliance with all applicable laws. You certainly have now heard about EMTALA. There are other laws that we have to respond to and act in accordance with, because simply this is one, may not be the highest regulated industry, but certainly is up there, if you will, right next to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with respect to that. So we have the False Claims Act, which dates all the way back to the Civil War and was initially signed into law by Abraham Lincoln because he was fed up.
Did you forget about your granddaughter Tina's worries?
I have it covered.
Thank you.
Oh, I thought you said you forgot.
Yeah.
I did not forget. I have other arrangements made.
Well, Honest Abe signed the False Claims Act into law simply because he was tired of getting ripped off by purveyors to the Union Army in terms of shoddy clothes, rotten food, and defective munitions, if you will. Now, obviously, that law has been expanded greatly over the past 150 years, of course, and now includes healthcare. So if you're signing a cost report, if you're basically bearing the responsibility for the submission of a claim, you're assuring the government that to the best of your ability, you are assuring that the services were provided for which you're seeking reimbursement. Now, obviously, that's an intent-based, what we call an intent-based law. That's it doesn't deal with mistakes, because if that were the case, we'd all be in jail. You know, mistakes just happen, if you will. But you can't turn a blind eye to it, because if you know it's wrong and you continue to do it, then the government assumes that you now have the requisite intent to be prosecuted. So. Also, we have to impose there are afforded whistleblower protections, so people who make good faith reports with regards to compliance or suspected compliance violations now have a certain series of protections available to them. The anti-kickback statute, which basically means that you can't buy, if you will, business or otherwise recognize business by in the form of a kickback. It's fairly self-explanatory. And then the last is the Stark Law. The anti-kickback statute and the Stark Law kind of work hand in glove. I also bear responsibility for all of the provider transaction contracts in the facilities, so I have to be particularly mindful of what we can and cannot do and what we have to do in the context of fashioning agreements with these physicians and other providers, if you will. Standard number 3, we expect that employees of the system will conduct themselves in accordance with the highest ethical standards in terms of their business transactions. Number 4, conflict of interest. We expect the duty of undivided loyalty. And a conflict of interest may occur if your outside activities, your personal financial interest, or other outside considerations influence or appear to influence your ability to make objective decisions on behalf of the facility. And the last, which I refer to as the Las Vegas rule, basically means if it happened here, it stays here. And you don't discuss it publicly or social media or anything else. It's interesting, and we'll get into that a little bit on the final thing. In the context of HIPAA, social media didn't even exist back when this law came into play back in 2003. Now, of course, it's prolific. And every once in a while, somebody will lose their mind and decide they think it's a good idea to talk about internal operations of the hospital or patients or whatever on social media. How they arrive at that, I have no idea. But essentially, and one of the things Julie and I discussed earlier today, one of the things associated with HIPAA that everybody needs to commit to memory is the minimum necessary rule, if you will. And that is, in order to do your job, you're entitled to access and use only that amount of protected health information, which is individually identifiable information associated with the patient, only to the extent that you need to access it in order to do your job. Now, on the extreme end of activities, you hear periodically about people of certain celebrity status will be admitted to a hospital out in Hollywood, right, Ben? And then what happens then? Then you read about 300 or 400 people who have then accessed their medical record. Well, that's just voyeurism, pure and simply. Now, in a small facility like this, I recognize people wear a variety of hats, and so you have to be mindful of that. But still, especially in a community where people either are related to each other or know each other throughout, you still have a common sense obligation to confine your use of protected health information to the extent that you need to do your job, and everything else stays here. No social media, no public gatherings in the aisle of the local supermarket. In other words, it's very common sense in that regard. So if you keep that in mind in terms of compliance with HIPAA, you'll do fine. So that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my presentation. I appreciate your time. If anybody has any questions they'd like to discuss, I'm certainly here to help you out with them. Okay. Thanks, folks.